Hello and welcome to the Cuyamonga Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute. And along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach, we want to thank you for joining us today. If you're less familiar with the Cuyamonga Institute and who we are, we're an independent, nonprofit anthropological research organization that's committed to expanding consciousness through the ancient practice of ecstatic transpostures, and it was the insightful work of our founder, anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman, who found the clues and revived this practice. So, today we want to take an interesting journey and look specifically at the science of sound. I mean, sound is at the foundation of the work here at the Institute. We do sound induction. The practice of ecstatic transpostures is founded on a rhythmic sound, whether it's rattling, drumming, clapping of the hands, or any kind of induction from sound. And it's been foundational from the very beginning that takes us into the journeys that we experience. We're fortunate today to have David Elkington, who's going to take us into a much more detailed explanation of the power of sound, the history, and the sacredness of sound. So I'm going to let Laura do a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll invite David in on the discussion here.
Well, I want to say that we have been looking at worldview for a long, long time, and the remnants of worldviews held by earlier societies, because it all comes and impacts us. We have so much in our own current collective and even our individual worldviews that is impacted by those of the past. Maybe we don't even recognize it. So I think it's worthwhile to kind of examine history for how did people view the world and their place in it and their environment. So this is part of that journey. And so we spent the last several weeks looking at different aspects of that, from mythology to theater and its origins and shamanic roots and all of that. So David Elkington is looking specifically at sound and resonance, and where we get ideas from Egypt and the Indo-European whole body of work. And I think this is an important piece. We do so many Egyptian postures based on Egyptian artifacts in our work too. So this is a good dive into that. So I want to tell you a little bit about David. We first met David when I was sent this book during our radio show years. And this looked good. Interviewed David, and soon he was issuing an invitation to come and join him in England and a bunch of his friends to do an experiment at a 12th century Templar chapel, few of which remain. And from there, we were off and running, looking at this body of work and resonance, and introducing us to John Reed and his cymatics experiments, and on and on. So David's newest book, The Ancient Language of Sound, is a reissue and an update of that book. And we talked with David a little bit earlier, just touching on this, but now today we get to go into depth with this. Mm-hmm. He's an Egyptologist and linguist, looking deep into the etymology of words, all self-taught. He's lectured at Cambridge and Oxford universities, widely on various television programs and seminars. And he's here today to join us and tell us a little bit about his work and a little bit about our work, and where the two merge. We'll suss that out with him. Hello, David, and welcome.
Hi, guys. Good to see you.
Yeah. Welcome, David. Yeah. So let's start from the beginning. Tell us a little bit about how this all came into your life and what.
How did you start on this journey?
Yeah.
I love the fact you just said, let's start from the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, St. John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I mean, what could be better to talk about rhythmic vibration being the source of everything? It is quite fantastic, isn't it? And yet, when we look at the word in terms of Latin, the word in Latin, one word, is universe. So you have the universe. I mean, it's in a sense, it's so simple, but it's mind-blowing. I find it just very, very remarkable. And actually, I got into this because I've always been fascinated by the idea of how sound affects us, affects our mood. I can be a fairly moody person, and I find that different sounds will affect my mood. None more so than when I'd just broken up from a lady with whom I was head over heels in love back in the early 80s. I was heartbroken, and I guess having been beaten up by the emotional side of it, I was kind of in the right spot for something to happen. And I found myself at Wells Cathedral in Somerset, England, which is a Gothic cathedral built in the 1200s. And I was wandering around when I suddenly saw a side door leading up to the stairs of the chapter house, which I have a photograph in the book. And these stairs, I mean, you walk up them, they're very broad, they're very wide, and you can see that hundreds of years of footfall have worn them down. So they seem to be almost glutinous. They've kind of melted with history. And I walked up in this kind of daze, this trance. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know where my life was going. I didn't really know anything. And then as I got to the top there, I could hear the cathedral choir, which is a very famous choir in Europe, beginning to rehearse their carol service for December. I think I was there in early December, late November. And then suddenly, at the optimum moment, as they were singing these beautiful medieval hymns, suddenly I just felt myself completely transformed. I was, as it were, translated into the heavens. And I was really, I was not in control. I was just taken away. That was it. And I don't know how long the experience lasted for. It was a good 15 minutes, half an hour or so. And I just realized that when I got back to terra firma, I came down the stairs, went through the vast oak door of the entrance of the chapter house, shut it, and thought, bloody hell. I suddenly realized that something really deep and profound had happened. And I found myself just in a real state. I had tears down my eyes, and it was just, I thought, I've got to find out more about this. What has happened? And in that state, I realized I could see everything at once. I suddenly realized that I could know everything at once. It was so utterly profound. Yet when I came out of it, suddenly I didn't know everything. It was like I kind of left Eden, and I was suddenly on the outside, looking in, and I was thinking to myself, gosh. And that's when the quest began.
That's a good start for a quest, isn't it? It seems to be the universal quest.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you guys, I mean, everybody here must have had similar experiences. I can't believe I'm alone in this. You know, we all have that sense of the numinous. I mean, when I was brought up to a certain degree by Aboriginal peoples there. And I always had a sense of the numinous, something within the landscape that seemed to be living. It was eternally present, not past or future. It was eternally now. And it tickled me. It tickled me in a way that I wanted to understand what it was, that feeling. I still get it to this day. And when you read poetry, you read the great landscape poets. When you read, when you look at art, I mean, you look at people like J.M.W. Turner, his paintings. You look at the great watercolorists of the 17th, 18th century, particularly here in England. Of course, I'm going to be biased here because I was brought up in an English background. You get this sense of the numinous, of the quest to understand the living, breathing aspect of the landscape and our association with it. It's very deep, it's very profound, and it's something that has guided our culture for many thousands of years, and we give it very, very little time in terms of analyzing it, in terms of acknowledging it. We need to acknowledge this. We give ourselves the credit, but actually, no, we've been switched on by something quite majestic, quite wonderful. And here we are about to leave planet Earth and we really don't know much about our own planet, let alone seeking to understand why, you know, we're heading to the moon or Mars. It seems bizarre to me, you know.
We'll just trash again like we've done this planet. You have an interesting list in your book about the heroes of old in mythology and their role. And then you say that the hero's job was to be that liaison between humanity and the gods. Our work is to say all of us have that role as liaison between us and the spirits and the numinous. But you cite that the heroes were assigned this role. Can you speak to that? Because that seems to be, again, the eternal quest to...
Yeah, well, it's exactly it. I mean, we are the hero, but you have to kind of get yourself into that kind of state, as it were. The thing I realized quite early on was that we are rhythmically, biologically, mentally, and physically connected to our home planet in a way, as I say, that is dangerous for space exploration if we don't understand this concept more fully than we do at the present time. The point being that the Earth resonates at an average frequency of 32 hertz or 32 vibrations per second.
The Schumann resonance.
Yeah, exactly, after W.O. Schumann, who discovered these things. Now, you know, there's four main bands of brainwave frequency. There's delta, alpha, beta, and theta, which go all the way from 0.5 hertz to 13 hertz. The key rhythm for connecting with our planet is actually the alpha rhythm, which is 7 to 13 hertz or vibrations per second. Now, at the optimum part of that frequency, 8 hertz, that is a harmonic of Earth frequency. That's the point at which suddenly we open up and we actually connect with Mother Earth. And we do this naturally 2 times a day when you go into and come out of sleep. And it's an interesting frequency because if you're in it, you are able to widen your consciousness to a degree where you can resolve problems that perhaps, you know, are milling around in your mind, in your work. Hence that maxim: if you have a problem, sleep on it. Because
or
as I say,
scientists look to the dream state for their major...
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So my idea was this: as soon as we, as human beings, have emerged from, you know, the cave, we are troglodytes. We apparently, according to historians, as soon as we emerge from the caves, what do? The first thing we do is we don't build banks, schools, shopping centers. We don't build swimming pools and malls. We don't do any of that. The first thing we do is we build the sacred site. And we take a lot of care and attention to the detail of those sacred sites. Why? Well, it's a bit like the old bit of graffiti we saw when Steven Spielberg's film came out in the early 80s, E.T. Phone Home.
Oh, I see. Get back in touch with Mother Earth, because that's where...
Exactly, we've got to stay in touch with Mother Earth because, yeah, kids leave home, but they leave home gradually. They do so steadily because they're always coming back to visit, because they need the advice of mum and dad. They need to still key into the comforts of home, the womb environment of which they have become used to. And of course, as we get older, we separate that and we become gradually more independent, but we gradually we get over it by having our own families and recreating that environment. So that's basically what we are doing as a species. So then it struck me that very early on that these places are built with a liturgical or ritual purpose, and that is what has been recorded in the records of these places where we're able to access them. And if you look at those records, they're myths and legends. The hero plays a very, very, very prominent part. And always, the hero actually brings not just healing, not just awareness. The hero brings script. He brings the knowledge of the written word. And I thought that was quite profound. Now, having, as you've seen it for yourself, when we've undertaken research at these places, and we've used cymatics, which is to see sound waves in physical form. When we've looked at optimum frequencies at these places, it has always taken linguistic form. So in other words, we went to St. Catherine's in southern Dorset, and the forms we had in the cymatic patterns were very Celtic, and they were linguistic. When I went to India, we had Hindu forms. They took the form of the Om and other forms of lettering, etc. And then more profoundly, with John Reed over in Egypt, deep in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, when we did the same patterns, we threw the internal frequencies of the Great Pyramid at the membrane covering the sarcophagus, we ended up with hieroglyphs. And they were not just fuzzy photographs, these were really well-defined hieroglyphs. The Eye of Horus, we had the hieroglyph for Ra, and at the optimum frequency of the internal part of the king's chamber, when we threw that at the membrane, John got a pharaoh in the guise of Tutankhamun, literally winking his eye like that as the sound waves flowed, as the great pulses of sound flowed at that membrane. At which point John tells this very funny story of how the fellowhin, who had helped to carry his equipment all the way up the Grand Gallery, ran out in some alarm because they thought he was a witch or a wizard, you know.
Wow.
Now, I'm working on a project at the moment called the Jordan Codices. It's about these lead books we found in Jordan that have turned out to be the earliest Christian documents. And they're written in a very early form of Hebrew called Paleo-Hebrew. It's very, very archaic. I mean, we're talking here about a language that goes back all the way to 1600 BC, and it's more or less the first alphabet. And what's interesting is that the figure of Jesus is called the Word in John's Gospel. And if we go back to the Old Testament, you've got this figure of Joshua, which is the same name as Jesus, on the mountain with Moses, who comes down the mountain with the tablets of God that God has apparently himself written, you know, the 10 Commandments. Well, whoopee-doo, because basically God's saying in that legend, this is called the alphabet, it's script, and from now on you're going to use this. And it seems to me that that emerged from a temple environment atop the mountain. And I've recently found hard evidence to show that that was very much the case. It was actually the Temple of Hathor at Serebet El Khadim in southern Sinai. So we've got the archetypal myth yet again in that most familiar of categories, the very religion that we've all been conditioned to see and believe in to a certain degree. I mean, fortunately, we live in more skeptical times now. But again, we have the same patterns worldwide. You have the same legend worldwide. Quetzalcoatl is the god of the Central Americans. That's the same at the pyramid of the moon and the sun. We have this extraordinary discovery that the pyramid of the moon and the sun may well have been constructed to actually resonate the cry of the Quetzal, that fabulously exotic bird that lives in the locality, because it actually sings a kind of a song that is like ee-oo. Now that sounds a bizarre way of putting it, but I'm putting it linguistically rather than doing an impersonation of the bird, because I wouldn't be so damn fool enough to do that. But what I'm saying is, if you then compare that ee-oo sound to the original religious texts surrounding the legend of the Greek myth of Dionysius, you'll see in those ancient legends great reams of these things written down by the ancient authors, just vowels, just pages and pages of vowels of A's, E's, O's, and U's. And these were supposed to be sung at the particular sites to which this god was dedicated. When we look at the Great Pyramid, we look at the former Temple of Jerusalem, and you know, and we look at other sites. What we see at the moment are shattered ruins. We just think, oh, they're dead. But once they were not dead. They were actually living, breathing places where you would hear music. Of course, now the music's died, all we think of is, oh gosh, you know, we look at them, we analyze them, but we forget They were very fluid. They were places of music and dance, and it was something that celebrated the joy of life, the joy of the hero, and of course the joy of his relationship between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're saying that these ancient sites were a form of technology to align us, to tune us to this earth frequency or the frequency of the heavens. So
We are the technology. That's exactly it. We've created this world around us of objective technology, where if you want to turn over the television, you've got to pick up the box and press the button and off you go. But actually, we are the button. We can press ourselves and we can change immediately. If we want to make the big evolutionary breakthrough, we need to actually become more subjective in our technology, i.e. us.
and I think ritual, to live, to gesture, the choreography of ritual that includes the dance, the music, the sound, the song, the sung. You sing and you're activating, you're starting to vibrate your chest and lungs area. It's a fascinating look at it. It's a huge missing piece, David. So
It is quite extraordinary, the level to which you see this on a regular basis throughout the world. It is quite staggering. You go around everywhere and you see the same patterns, you see the same, you know, the same elements of ritual, the same effects, and you think, gosh, there's more to this than meets the eye. And it's very true. There is much more to it than meets the eye, because basically it's telling us the story of who we are, where we are, and how we are. And that's, you know, that's a very, very important thing.
and I really truly get it when you're activating it, when you're hearing the songs as you did, when you're hearing the beat of the rattle. You have
Absolutely,
experience,
yeah.
direct experience is a big teacher and a big missing piece of this
The
understanding.
Enuma Elish is the Mesopotamian story of creation. It goes back to 5,000 BC, and it starts Enuma Elish Lanabu Shamanu. Okay, so it's called Enuma Elish because it's the first words of the text, and they that's what it was called. But it's the word Shamanu within it, because the whole line actually translates, "When on high the heavens were not yet named." And what that's talking about is a ritual within the central temple of Marduk, which was called the Isagila in Babylon, where the shaman would actually do his or her stuff, and they would go into their trance-like state, and they would become the ones who named creation. So basically, the shaman would do his stuff, and he would go into this trance-like state, or she would go into the trance-like state, and then in conjoining with the Spirit of God, would actually begin to name things. The naming of things is the act of creation. It is what makes things suddenly come alive within our own consciousness.
You have a frequency that you're tapping into, and
Yeah,
then helps
absolutely.
it manifest into this
Yeah,
reality.
yeah. And to my mind, it's like the beginning of taxonomy. We're able to see suddenly the categories of things beyond ourselves, but by giving them names, they become much more personal to us. And that in itself is an act of the widening of consciousness. You see, so these places are all about the idea of breaking open your mindset to become much more self-aware.
I mean, our whole world revolves around frequencies, the little frequencies of the notes going through the optic fibers that deliver the message. We're kind of recreating that in a sense mechanically, aren't we?
We are, but by the same token, there's a huge amount of acoustical distortion and dissonance that occurs at the present time, because you know of the nature of
Too much signal.
yeah. Well, I mean, the
Too much
Earth now
data
is like a
going
golf ball. It's like the innards of a golf ball. If you look at the innards of a golf ball, it's just basically one mass of elastic bands wrapped around each other, and that basically is a
through. Okay.
great way of seeing the Earth today, because we have got so much electromagnetic distortion happening here, there, and everywhere, that basically our Earth is smothered in elastic bands, unable to resonate purely in the way in which it happened less than 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we again have got this technology that's out there, but we're not paying much attention to what's in here.
No, we're trying to shield ourselves from all of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you know from the Institute here, and there's still this battle to take the technology of us seriously. This whole idea of consciousness. I mean, you've got great people of the past 100 years. Max Planck said, you'll never be able to co-join the theory of the very large gravity with the very small quanta until we understand what the nature of consciousness is.
Oh, I love that quote.
You know, and he was absolutely right, because it's funny, isn't it? You know, I was brought up in a colonial atmosphere, you know, the remnants of the British Empire back in the 60s and 70s. And we were taught that native peoples, inverted commas, are just primitives, and they know sweet FA about anything, and that we're superior. And here we are 50, 60 years later, and now we're beginning finally, at last, to cherish these people for their knowledge, because their knowledge is really very dramatic indeed. It tells us so much about what we have not paid attention to.
So here we are paying attention. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
High time.
And so,
Yeah.
so the sacred place is what we need to look at more. We need, you know, it would be very amusing to think that the first thing we do when we get to Mars is not to build these great shelters or whatever, but to build the sacred place.
Yeah.
But you know, it's really interesting, because you can go for these trips to Mars. You can go anywhere via the Earth by just tuning in.
Yeah.
And the other thing I noticed as well was the similarity of the hero names worldwide. You always got the same kind of myth, always born of a wisdom figure who is female, always born of a mysterious missing father who happens to be the Sky Father, and the names are very similar as well. I mean, I don't know if you know, there's a tribe of Native American peoples who have worshipped for millennia this god called Yahweh.
Oh, no.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is extraordinary, isn't it? Now, and in Britain, in the pre-Christian BC, they worshipped a man who had been nailed to a tree called Esus. You see, he's called the god of the tree. And it's things like this that begin to kind of make you think, well, hang on a minute. I'm not doubting the story of Jesus by a long shot. I think he's very much a figure who existed, who lived and breathed. And I think the most remarkable thing about his story is that he obviously went out to become the hero, to fulfill those prophecies that Christians are always banging on about. But in terms of actually, you know, doing this, he was drawing down an innate kind of wisdom that effectively transformed our world into what it is today. The great tragedy being, of course, that it then became dogmatic. You know, what the great tragedy of the Western world today is that to go to church, you now have to speak to God through a priest. It's just ludicrous, isn't it, really? Why can't we speak direct? Why can't we have a direct line?
Yeah.
This is what annoys me a bit about publishing. In order to speak to my audience, I have to go through a publisher. You know, so I have to go through the confessional, and the confessional is to have my script professionally looked at by an editor to check what is right for the audience to read. We haven't come very far since the days of the early Catholic Church, but joking apart, it is tragic that actually we've become so separate from the site that we no longer look at it with any reverence. It's kind of like it's a part of our past, and we have heritage committees to keep it, you know, alive. We have it deconstructed by academic teams from here, there, and everywhere else, who don't realize that their own biases towards their ideas of what these places were are all rooted in the modern world.
I also say that there's such a benevolent creator, such a benevolent universe that has given us so many avenues to experience the numinous and that state of betwixt and between, and to get there. Our spontaneous mystical moments are demonstrative of how readily and how geared we are to experience that. I think the ancients just had various ways of assisting that and putting that at the center of their culture.
Mm.
which we've lost today. So
Yeah, I think we've lost the ritualistic aspect of it. I'll give you an example. Even war was ritualistic. Amongst the Highland tribes of Papua New Guinea today, war and battle is still a ritual.
Mhm.
It's a natural ritual that happens because that is the way humans are. But at least they understand it's a ritual, and in that it's kind of contained. Going back to about 1300 BC, the Great Battle of Kadesh between Ramses II of Egypt and the Hittites. The Hittites say that they won the battle. The Egyptians say they won the battle, and the latest archaeological evidence suggests it was a draw, 1-1, and that basically it was a ritual battle. Actually, it was a ritual battle so that both could then come together to then have peace talks and hey presto, you know, they're our favorite people. And you do have to laugh about it because we haven't come very far in the modern age. You know, we've got saber rattling going on between America and Russia, saber rattling going on between Syria and the UK. And what's it all about? It's we today, you know, in British diplomacy, they called it the Great Game, you know, but that's from the original Latin gamos, meaning ritual. And it is exactly that. It's just an amusing part of the human character.
So we're but really returning to the power of ritual of sound, David. I mean, what you're saying in some ways that's one of the lost components. Um, maybe
to understand
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
and understand.
Yeah.
Well, yes. I mean, it's all very well investigating these things and sitting down as an academic to look at your boring books and read and write boring things about boring places. A, they were never boring. B, we should start from the point of view of going there and resonating them, going there and singing at them. There is nothing like the sound of a choir in a Gothic cathedral.
Mm.
It totally makes the places come alive. Now, consider this. One of the great mysteries of European history at the present time is that from about 1130 onwards, suddenly there was this massive explosion of the building of the Gothic throughout the whole of Europe. We still don't know the economics of that, how on earth that we could afford it. It's almost as great a mystery as the building of the Great Pyramid itself, because we know the pyramid was constructed within 20 years. And yet, from the offset, the sums are that from the moment that Pharaoh, you know, pressed the trigger on the starting gun, they'd had to have put one block of 2.5-ton block of sandstone into place every 2.5 minutes.
Okay. How do
Okay.
you do that? Yeah.
How do you do it? Exactly? And it's the same with the Gothic. It's like, how on earth did they achieve it?
Yeah.
One thing that's not given credit for is the power of place itself to actually to motivate us to get going, you know. And so when you go into these places, St. Bernard of Clairvaux said that cathedrals are more or less books in stone. Now imagine you're a peasant in 12th century Europe. You don't know how to read, you can't write, there are no newspapers, certainly no computers or telephones. You just work in the fields and that's that. And suddenly you get to go into a cathedral and you get to actually see the interior of this place. It must have been absolutely mind-blowing to see colored glass for the first time, to see these great palaces of light, and then to hear choirs sing. Goodness me, the effect must have been absolutely astonishing. And so, of course, over a course of 200 or 300 years, vast swathes of the population are going into these places on a regular basis, and they're undergoing the same transformation that happened to me 30 odd years ago. And then suddenly we got to ask ourselves why it is that within the space of 200 or 300 years, we have the rise of the Renaissance and the approach to the age of reason via the Enlightenment. We give ourselves the credit, but actually, what about the places? They actually woke us up. They provoked something deep within us that contributed on a massive scale towards our sense of curiosity, towards our sense of wanting to ask more questions.
You say that not only does the universe have these hidden patterns, but place specifically has hidden patterns specific to that place. You have a slideshow. Do you want to go run through your slides?
Yeah, actually, let's do that. That's a good idea.
It's nice to have some visuals.
A lot of these were taken by my great friend Paul Broadhurst, and Paul is a great, what can I say? He's a great pilgrim to sacred places. He believes, like me, that they are immensely powerful places that we simply, we should get to know more clearly, more intimately. We should start to have relationships with the sacred place.
Yes.
I mean, as you can see it here on the front of the book. Actually, you can see this great Gothic dome, which again, in many ways, reflects the acoustic sound patterns we've seen on the cimoscope. We've had exactly these patterns in the deep interior of the sacred site.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and go. David, I did throw up a slide just showing our previous conversation so that people knew that the experiment that we did is online. We have an article about it. We also have the previous YouTube video of that conversation. That's a picture of David and I together back when we were young men and
at the Temple Chapel with the cymatics experience.
And that's the showing,
yeah. When Paul played the flute, that's the pattern that showed up like that.
Yeah, I know. It was an amazing day as well. I think everybody was very taken. I mean, this is St. Catherine's monastery. It's the remains of a monastery on a high hill in southern Dorset, itself in southern England. And as you can see, it's right on the coast of the Atlantic Sea. And it's a most extraordinary place. And you come down this high road and you suddenly see it ahead of you. And during the springtime, when you've got the summer mists about to dissipate, it adds to the mystery. And one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, how on earth did we select these places? Why specifically there? Because some of the places that were chosen seem to be terribly inconvenient. In the distance we can see the beginnings of the city of Weymouth. So of course you can see that wherever the sacred site is built, there's generally civilization to be had. And yet here we are high on a hill, and actually this hill itself is very, very rich in natural radon gas beneath it. Radon is a natural earth gas. It's a noble gas. It doesn't interact with other gases, and it affects the well water. Now, oddly enough, in terms of well water and stuff, I worked with the East Anglian Water Authority here in the UK, and we did some tests with bacterium, introducing it into tap water, into river water, and then the water from holy wells. In the river water and tap water, the bacterium spread. It grew, it thrived, it flourished. As soon as we put it into the well water, which was the holy well of St. Withburger, an early Saxon saint, it died. So the well water is extremely pure, and because it's laced with radon gas, bacterium doesn't have a chance. And yet this well water is associated with sacred healing. It was quite often used to baptize and christen young children, and it was used always for healing and other remedies. In fact, the Irish were so good at it that they worked out that they could turn holy well water into booze, which is exactly what they did. That's how whiskey was developed, oddly enough. It used to be a sacred drink. Unfortunately, I don't have any with me at the moment, but one day soon.
Yeah. I'm going to forward a slide for you here, David.
Yep.
I have one we'll come back to later talking about acoustical experiments on Stonehenge, but I want to go to your slide number 1 here.
Trevethy Kite, yes, again, this is about sort of 3,500 BC, has got the most remarkable sound wave patterns. And again, it's something that resonates to an extremely low frequency, has a profound effect upon brainwave patterns. And of course, what we're looking at here is some of the earliest type of monumental architecture in Western Europe, and obviously developed for that reason. This might well have been actually enclosed chamber at the very beginning. It might well have been enclosed within a hill, which obviously over the centuries has been taken away. It was the same at West Kennet Long Barrow. You go into the barrow, and we think it was designed for ritual purposes, for people to undergo a ritual of spiritual death, as it were, which is something which is very key to the mystery religions and has been for millennia. Again, this is very interesting. This again is in Cornwall. It's not far away from the site of the last site, Trevethicoit. It's a labyrinth, and this is another cymatic form that we found quite a lot at sacred places, including Chartres Cathedral, oddly enough. And Chartres Cathedral has its own labyrinth, which is very famous. And actually, it's geared towards the summer solstice on the 21st of June. And on the 21st of June, light will come through the main window at Chartres and accurately align itself directly to that labyrinth. So we think these are sun symbols, but also on those days, these places they're at their most powerful. So somatically speaking, these are a profound piece of science, or at least the last vestiges of. Yeah. Now, this is really interesting. I don't know if anybody's had this experience, but wherever you go on this, if you guys were to go, Laura and Paul, and try and distance yourselves from each other, so from one end to the other, and one of you whispered, wherever you are, you will hear that whisper quite perfectly. So there's no getting away. You will not be able to gossip at this place, thinking that you're out of sound range with the other person, because they'll get to hear everything. Again, it's a demonstration of how perfect the acoustics were in the ancient world, and how these things were engineered in particularly that way. Because of course, this is a theatre. It was used for that effect. Now, let's not think of theatre in modern terms as a means of entertainment. The word theatre comes from theos, or thea, the divine feminine, which therefore implies wisdom. So you go there to see performances of ancient ritual plays, which would impart their wisdom to you. So again, there's a purpose, there's a liturgical purpose here.
Another view.
It's lovely, isn't it? I wish I could go back there now, actually.
Mm.
And Bourges Cathedral, again, is a lovely example of the early Gothic. Again, the most astonishing sound wave patterns to be had at these places. Our Gothic cathedrals are, well, they are the European treasure par excellence. They are wonderful, beautiful places, regardless of whether you're Christian or not. They're just so, so wonderful. Yeah, now this is really interesting. If we look at the enthroned Christ, he's carrying a book and he's holding up his finger as if to say it comes from heaven, but he's actually portrayed here inside a mandorla, which in Italian means an almond shape. Now, interestingly enough, this mandorla is the exact shape of a standing waveform, which we find quite often in the acoustics of sacred places. So even more interesting is that this hieroglyph, this standing waveform, is in ancient Egyptian the hieroglyph for creation. It's called a primordial scission, and basically it talks of a sound wave pattern existing at the very, very beginning of creation. So we have here a long tradition, and there is Christ seated in this standing waveform as the word of God. So it's saying the word is rhythmic vibration. It couldn't be any more explicit. And again, beautiful Chartres Cathedral. And if you look again at the tympanum here, the way it seems to be echoing outwards, it's quite astonishing, isn't it? It's like the echo, like a sound wave in itself in 3 dimensions. It's quite wonderful. My current project, the lead codices from Jordan, which again seem to be speaking of acoustic frequencies in what they have to offer, and there'll be more of that forthcoming in the next couple of months or so. I think the next one's a codex as well, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, an open codex. This one wasn't sealed all the way around, but a lot of the codices have been sealed in order to actually preserve their secrets, because we mustn't forget that although script came from these sites, or so I believe, it was actually only allowed to be learned by those who were initiated into its mysteries. So of course the church kept hold of the ability of educating people in the art of reading and writing for a very, very long time. Because of course, once you have script, and once you know how to read, you can run off with it. You can go and create your own empires. And this is the goddess of wisdom in her earliest form. In her hands, she carries the Egyptian Ankh cross, which basically means life. She, as I say, she's a figure of wisdom, which is why she is flanked by two owls, owls being the symbol of wisdom in Greece. And of course, she stands upon two lions, which means that she can control the emotions in order to actually learn. She is the symbol of knowledge. I love this one personally. This is one of my favorite ones, even if I took this photograph myself, and I apologize for the lack of humility. But the fact of the matter is, this is standard English fan vaulting from the interior of Exeter Cathedral from around about the 1280s. And interestingly enough, it's like a lotus flower holding up creation. It's kind of Egyptian in a funny way. But what fascinates me is again, it's like a series of waveforms that kind of help the voice. These are extraordinarily resonant places. And the fan vaulting is an acoustic masterpiece. It is quite wonderful. Again, to be seen all over Europe and elsewhere. So, and this is Bath Abbey in my old hometown of Bath. And as you see, it's not so dramatic, the fan vaulting. This is called the perpendicular style. It's very late. It's around about the 1400s. But again, you get that sense of majesty. You've got the Gothic columns. You've got the pointed arches, which again reflect the back of the throat. If you look at the back of your mouth in the mirror in the mornings, if it's not too revolting a sight, you'll see that you have Gothic arches at the back of it. I haven't looked at the back of mine for a long time because I need to get some dental work, but there we go.
That's there too, David. You always talked about the rosettes that show up on the cymatics patterns when you're in the churches. So you can see those.
Oh, yeah,
both
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's so much that comes up at different frequencies and things, but it always associated with these places. I mean, it's like a hidden science. It's just so profound. Yeah, what can I say? This is King Joseph's step pyramid, third dynasty, circa 2800 BC. It's the first piece of monumental architecture in human history. And actually, it's recently reopened for the first time in 30 years because it was a British guy who actually stabilized the crumbling masonry on the exterior and the interior. So you can now go in and see the beauty of the interior, which is very remarkable. Don't be put off by the state of it from the outside as it seems here. Inside it is extremely beautiful with green and blue tiles everywhere. But the superstructure of this is actually a negative pillar. So in other words, the space itself takes the form of a pillar, and actually we have that structure built around it. And again, the pyramid is very curious. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the real crystalline shape of salt, but salt is one of those things, again, that plays a much underrated part in the rise of human civilization, because without it, there would have been no civilization. Salt, again, was used by Roman soldiers to pay each other, hence the word salary, which basically means to give salt. And if you compare a salt crystal to Joseph's pyramid, you'll find there's not much difference between the two. So I wonder if there's some kind of internal thing going on with our consciousness about these things. It's not something that we've built consciously. It's almost as if it's been constructed unconsciously in that way. Again, I write about this in the central part of the book in relation to the pyramid of the moon at Teotihuacan in Mexico. The Great Pyramid. What can I say? The Great Pyramid is just beyond all superlatives. It is just the most extraordinary place, I think, on the planet. these massive 85-ton granite slabs piled atop each other are just beyond belief. How did they do it, we wonder? This illustration here, we can see the Egyptian Ankh surmounting what is called an Azirian Jed Pillar. It's said to be the backbone of the hero god Osiris. And you can see that there's a comparison to be made with the internal plan view of the king's chamber and the superstructure above it. We have 5 relieving chambers, and then above those, we have these massive 85-ton slabs of granite, which are supposed, until recently, to actually hold off the pressure from the external masonry bearing down. But actually, it's recently been discovered that there would be no need to have these relieving chambers. If that were the case, you could just have the slabs over the king's chamber itself. So we are back to the mystery of why the relieving chambers were constructed, and here's my answer. I think it's actually in imitation of the Jed Pillar. Now, if we go to the next slide, this is the culmination of the book. The Great Pyramid is the only pyramid in Egypt with chambers built above ground. So if you go into all the pyramids, you'll find the chambers all go below ground, but not the Great Pyramid. And it's been a mystery for a long time as to why the Great Pyramid is the exception to the rule. And we can see here the Great Pyramid with the relieving chambers above it, the king's chamber, sorry, and beneath that, the queen's chamber. Now, if we go to the Osirian texts, the Book of the Dead, to prayer number 660, I think it is, it's in the book, it says, O Lord Osiris, who gathers at the dawn, if you look from the pyramid at dawn, you will see Osiris. Now that's mystified Egyptologists for a long time. And it occurred to me that basically, if you look to the dawn through the pyramid, and you can somehow get a transparent pyramid with the chambers inside showing it, and I actually managed to get hold of one. If you look at it, look at the dawn through the pyramid, all of the chambers come together to give the outline of the mummified Osiris. And I show that with the Shabdi figure on the right-hand side that shows Osiris's feet sticking out like a mummy. And of course, he's wearing he's got the famous Egyptian wig. And of course, you'll see where the queen's chamber is exactly where his heart would be in the mummy. Now, we found, very interestingly, John did his experiments here. He found that in the king's chamber, the sarcophagus, it's surprisingly short. I don't think it was ever used. I think it was always a ritually based object rather than a tomb. It actually resonates to the heartbeat of a newborn child. Mm-hmm. Now we think, therefore, the Great Pyramid was used as a ritual rebirthing chamber, as it were. So basically, the old pharaoh who had just passed away had become the god Osiris, and the new pharaoh was therefore his son Horus. But he would have to be reborn spiritually. He would have to go through a night of spiritual darkness, and this is what happened inside the Great Pyramid. And there's much more to boot. What can I say? We found that the inner frequencies of the pyramid, from the Grand Gallery all the way up to the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber, are all whole numbers. Never have we found anything like it on the planet. At Chartres, the acoustics, for instance, are something like 117 hertz, 0.6894, etc., and so on and so forth across the world. Not at the Great Pyramid. In the Great Pyramid, you get an ascending shaft at 50 hertz to 125 hertz to 250 hertz, 0.000, I hasten to add, and finally into the King's Chamber itself, where it's 500 hertz, and it's just like, it's acoustically perfect. This is impossible, but obviously not, because it's right there around us. And I believe that it's the birth chamber of the god Osiris. I mean, the whole Pyramid Plateau is named after Osiris, and we know for a fact that the Great Pyramid was in its day called the place of the Ascension, which is very, very familiar to those who are Christians. So it's a very, very interesting correlation.
And David, we had the great privilege in the 1990s. We were in the Great Pyramid, and we did sound. And so we went in this, and I was able to lie down in the sarcophagus while we all did sounding and toning. Boy,
Wow!
Sounded like a choir of angels.
Talk about
Just
a
a bunch of
powerful
strangers.
vibrational sound. I can't even describe.
It's the most staggering place, isn't it? I mean, and then basically, this is the form that appeared in John's experiment on the sarcophagus, on the membrane he stretched over it. He put a speaker below that, and we threw the internal frequencies through that speaker, and the sound parted to give us the double eye of Horus. Now, this is forbidden knowledge. You often get the appearance of one eye or the other, but you'd never really get the appearance of both. This is a later incarnation from around about the 18th, 19th dynasties, but in the very early days, you were not allowed to put these two things together to be seen in general. They were supposed to be hidden away, as this was itself, because of course, this comes from a sarcophagus. This is called the Nebucha, and in ancient Egyptian thinking, this is the secret holy name of God, the infinite, the ineffable. This is their way of expressing that. It's kind of like little meets big. It's like black meets white. It's like good meets evil. It's the coalescing, the unity of all things. It is the most sacred expression in hieroglyphics. And that's what we had on the sarcophagus when we threw the optimum frequency of the pyramid at that membrane. And this is really, well, it's very profound stuff.
You talk a lot about Osiris, and you talk about the heroes. So put Osiris in context. So many of us have lost the meaning of these myths, right? They're not our myths, but they're there in the whole cultural history of humanity. So they are our myths. But many of us aren't that familiar with Osiris and his role. So let's talk about that.
It's really interesting, actually. I was trained privately as an Egyptologist in the 80s under Dr. Julia Sampson, who herself was trained by Sir Matthew William Flinders Petrie, the father of archaeology. So I can trace my lineage back to the old man himself, which is great.
All right.
And Julia she was fascinating. She was such a fabulous lady. She worked for British intelligence during the war in the fight against Nazism and Adolf Hitler. She was that kind of stiff upper lip Brit who basically, no nonsense, we're going to get this done, end of story, boom, boom, you know. And it was great working under her because you knew where you stood. She was such a fabulous lady. And she told me, people forget that the name Osiris is actually a Greek translation from the original. The original in Egyptian is Asar, A-S-A-R. But in early Egyptian, it was illegal to begin a word, a sentence, beginning with a vowel, because vowels were said to be the voices of the gods, as we know from the resonant frequencies at sacred sites, that the vowels have this, you know, they are the sounds, they are the rhythmic vibration.
Because you can continue a vowel, you can hold it.
Yeah.
You can't.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you're going to hop to, for instance, to catch a train, imagine the train is the moving vowel sound, but the consonant is actually the moment when you step onto it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have to kind of hitch a ride on the consonant to get to the vowels, in a sense. So the sacred consonant for Osiris is a letter G or a Y or a J. They were all the same sound. No, so basically, if you then look at the consonant needed to pronounce the name, and believe the god names were very, very holy in their day. They were quite forbidden. You have to be very careful to have the knowledge of this. As a priest, you would have the knowledge of it, but it wasn't for general consumption. So the consonant needed to pronounce that name was a G, a Y, or a J. which was, variations on the same sound. So Osiris's name was a version of Jisa or Jisu. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, his wife Isis is also a translation in the Greek from the Egyptian original. Her name was Ast or Aset, A-S-E-T or A-S-T. Hence the terms astronomy, astrology, and so on and so forth in today's modern English language. But she was actually called the Beloved. She was always referred to as Beloved, and Beloved in Egyptian is spelt M-E-R-Y and pronounced Mary. So again, we have this legend, that takes us back to a very, very early ritual form of the hero legend, which emerges from the sacred site. And obviously it's ritualistic. It's talking about a ritual that is undertaken by he who would become the hero, or she who would become the goddess, perhaps, wherein you would undergo spiritual death. And spiritual death entails, as you know, shamans going, beyond this state and actually crucifying the ego. It's getting rid of your view of yourself to actually bring enlightenment to your real self, your real consciousness. And I believe that this is the entirety of the religious impulse, which came directly from these places. Mm. And for me, the tragedy today is that I don't think this in any way diminishes the power of the Christian message. If we could get it right, it would actually enhance it so hugely. But it's so surrounded in dogma and doctrine and literalism. And it's very sad that that should be the case, because we're talking here about nothing more, nothing less than a spiritual technology.
Hmm. So in the whole context of heroes, Osiris and his wife and consort Isis were a pair, and the pharaoh is a stand-in for Osiris. And so ritually, the Great Pyramids ritual from which the building supports this is to send the pharaoh back to the heavens from whence he came and complete the cycle. Can you explain that?
Exactly.
Myth a little bit?
Well, if we go back to the penultimate illustration, Paul, if you go to the interior plan view of the Great Pyramid, and we can see coming from the Queen's and King's chambers, you can see these so-called ascending shafts. We've got it. Okay. Now you can see these whiskers. They look like the whiskers of a head of barley. And there's a link there, but that's for another conversation. But these ascending shafts were open in the King's chamber, but they were closed in the Queen's chamber below. And it was the Wayneman-Dixon brothers who in the 1880s were tapping around the walls and found that there was this cavity, and they uncovered the entrance to these two so-called ascending shafts. Now, interestingly enough, it seems that they were built on purpose to be enclosed, because the masonry matched that of the surrounding walls, so it hadn't been tampered with or bricked up in antiquity. It was actually part of the original masonry. Now, it seems to me, and John would agree with this, and I think other Egyptologists are kind of veering this way. Well, we have the ascent of Pharaoh going into the heavens, the old Pharaoh, Osiris, going to rejoin and become a star, to become the cosmic Osiris. These shafts would therefore represent in the feminine fallopian tubes, which would release the egg into the divine womb, and of course that would become the reborn pharaoh, and vice versa as well, because of course they're like sort of landing shafts. They can, or lift off areas where the spirit can ascend. So it's like sort of one pharaoh goes, one pharaoh comes in. And this is what's so curious about the sarcophagus in the King's chamber being the resonant echo of a newborn baby's heart. It's almost as if it is the chamber of rebirth, having, the cosmic egg having been fertilized from below, but within the Queen's chamber. And of course, we know it's aligned to certain constellations in the sky. This is at the moment being debated by scholars. They're not sure if the pyramid was meant to match up to the constellations of Orion or whatever. It's an ongoing debate, but I suspect that it was, and for this specific reason, I should say. We mustn't forget also that these places were places of astronomical observation. So again, it's a well-fitting match. It brings to mind another thing as well. In the Egyptian myth of Osiris, he's tricked into a coffin by his wicked brother Set or Seth, and then Seth shuts the coffin and actually pours lead all over it to seal it, which is curious for my research at present. And then in the story, which is a bit of an adventure story, Osiris has managed to extract himself from the coffin, only to find himself finally, his mummy is torn to shreds. It's torn into many pieces, and Isis goes around and finally she finds most of the pieces of her dead husband's body, and she brings them together. But the only thing that's missing, unfortunately for her, is the phallus. So she makes one, which does beg a certain question, because she then sort of inseminates herself with the child Horus, which is interesting in itself. But what's interesting is that quite often in shamanic myths, I've heard all over the world how the shaman, in the initial experiences of going into the trance state, when they're quite young and they're not used to going into this, they undergo this process of being torn limb from limb when they're in the other world, which is a breakdown of I guess the ego and elsewhere. And here we have in the Azirian myth an actual early, very, very early telling of that state. And I find that fascinating.
Well, okay, so Dr. Goodman always said that the shamanic roots in Egypt are very evident. That's why you have the animal-headed gods, and we have gods at work, and there's a lot going on, a lot of life, death, and rebirth experiences that we have. And
no, absolutely. I mean, I've been through the near-death state myself, and I can say I can thoroughly recommend it. It's a great experience. I have a thyroid problem, and I died on the operating table in 1995, and I remember everything. I remember the whole shamanic state. It was quite wonderful. As I said, death is completely underrated. I think it's something we could do with more of, actually, in order to understand, who we are and where we're going. You need to be ready for it, definitely. But however, approaching it helps you to respect not just the idea of death itself, but who you are and your connection to life around you. It's a kind of process of renewal, because you always come back with a sense of greater appreciation for life around you, and to the degree where you become a lot more sensitive to it. And actually you can see certain things that you can't generally see if you haven't been through it. You can see growth happening in plants on a microscopic level and all of that. But you come back from this state and you kind of, it's a state of ecstasy, because you're suddenly enamored of life in a way that, because you understand death, you've been there. And it's not just relief at having survived it, because actually most people who go through that experience don't want to come back. And I was one of them. I thought, well, why did I come back? Why did I make that stupid decision to come back? Because I felt I was wearing lead boots. But I realized latterly that, obviously I've got something to do. I've got to do something with my life, to gain entry again. Otherwise, I'll have St. Peter nodding his finger saying, no, 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 not yet, young man. You've still got things to do.
Well, we can just see how the shamans of old, when you have these spirit journeys, how that would continue through culture and become more and more ritualized, more and more elaborate. And if the pharaoh was the assigned liaison between humanity and the heavens, then him going back to either maintain the cycle of Osiris or to continue humanity's agreement with the gods, you can see why that would be very important, to continue that ritual, that your whole society would be based upon that. We have this avenue. We must keep it alive and activated. We must keep the cycle going and the rebirth going. And it's our
I agree. And I think that's very true. I just, somebody's just written, and I have to say, I totally agree with the the observation that Egyptologists, and it's not just Egyptologists, it's scientists per se, have rejected any idea or downplayed it, any idea of mysticism and what it means, because they think that myth is fantasy and it's rubbish. But myth, all it means in its original Greek is that which is spoken. You know, there is no need to be afraid. We're so used to actually using logic to limit our experience of the world rather than to expand it, because we've forgotten about the purity of science, which is about the purity of exploration, about understanding who we are and where we are in this world. You know, and there's, again, pure science today, I think, is dismissed as being almost mystical, and we can't have that, can we?
Or that we can give credence that they were onto something real, or like Max Planck was saying, to understand that we need to explore consciousness and give it its weight in the cosmological structure of the universe, to put the other half of the equation into our science and our understanding of the universe. Maybe then all the levels will come together, the unified field theory will come together. Maybe consciousness is that missing piece.
I agree entirely. I mean, again, I agree with another one of your comments here that not to impute science. I'm not seeking to do that, because science does indeed use inspiration, always has done. And I think here about Medvedev, who actually, back in 1871, I think it was, listened to Tchaikovsky at a concert event, went to bed, and said he felt completely changed and somehow altered, interesting word. Woke up the next day with the periodic table completely there in his mind, and all he had to do was write it down and transform chemistry as we know it. Again, you know, we use the inspiration, but I just feel very passionate about us being humble and saying, yes, I was inspired and I don't know where it came from, but wasn't it wonderful? Because again, the power of place is, you know, it's our home. We live on the earth. The power of place does have its role. It has a major role. It's not just us. It's the way we interact with these places that actually helps us to be where we are now. And I think that's incredibly important. And even, in fact, even the word inspire, it means in spiritus. It means to be in spirit. Experience is expirare in Latin. It means from out of the spirit. To be enthusiastic is entheos, to be in God, and so on and so forth. You cannot get away from the divine. Now, I'm not suggesting I know what the divine is, I hasten to add, but it's obviously a state of mind, and it's a state of mind that is greatly enhanced by these places. We just need to really start looking at that more, I suspect.
Well, and also the biochemistry. I mean, you talk, I have a friend who went to the Oracle of Delphi, and there's radon gas or some gas emanating from the Oracle.
Oh, there's lots of radon there, yes.
To help to put the oracles into a trance state. That very same shaft at the bottom of the original Lascaux was of some kind of gas that they know can't be tolerated for much longer than 20 minutes or so. Interesting, the same length of our trance.
Radon gas, again, radon gas. Samuel Coleridge wrote his some of the greatest poetry of the Romantic period. The tale of the ancient mariner, and he was halfway through his poem Xanadu, the great masterpiece, and he lived on Dartmoor in Western England. Dartmoor is on granite and it's completely laced in radon, and Coleridge had a well in his living room. He was literally breathing in, he was imbibing radon gas on a daily basis.
So Paul wants to ask about, very intrigued by this. And also, I have read where some of the latest ritual purposes they think of Stonehenge was, again, to be in touch with the ancestors, that it was kind of where you took the ancestors to bury them. What's the story? What am I remembering? Something. Is that something to do?
A load of experiments were undertaken at Stonehenge about 20 years ago by scientists from the University of Reading in southern England. And they found that Stonehenge was actually built to resonate to extremely low frequencies, we think theta rhythms, which are a very, very low state of brainwave frequency. They found that when they used drums, it really had a profound effect upon brainwave frequency with people sitting inside the circle. So what you've got in this recreation is Stonehenge as it once was, and of course these standing trilithons would have had a reflective value that would of course have reflected sound waves and induced these states, and again used for shamanic purposes, no doubt. At Newgrange we've got more or less the same, except that Newgrange in Ireland, the largest Neolithic monument in Europe, was again enshrouded in this vast hill. So you have to go into the interior. And Newgrange, a bit like Stonehenge, but even more, in more detail, is laced with interior rings of granite, and then exterior wise there's limestone. So what you've got is acoustic padding. So wave patterns can actually penetrate the granite through to the rear limestone stones, which then reflect it back again. So again, you've got this knowledge of the use of acoustics in the building of these superstructures. And again, all probably to one purpose, to alter our sense of who we are. It's very fascinating. One last thing I will tell you about, it's a theory at the moment, but it's one that I intend to demonstrate quite clearly. I'm actually hoping that I'm going to find a dead body soon. I've got a pathologist friend, and I want to sort of get permission from the person who has just expired to see if I can mummify them. And I want to do it using the ancient Egyptian method, because there is no reason in mummification whatsoever in Egyptian history to remove the brain through the nostrils. Okay, so this is what they would do. They would shove a hook up the nose, and then they'd get another hook, put it in, and they'd gradually pull out the brain bit by bit, and then they'd fill your head with cotton, etc. So a bit like a modern politician, really. And you know, there's no reason for this to be the case. Well, certainly not today, because politicians are born with cotton for brains. But in those days, when we had brains, you know, obviously they had to be removed, or so they thought. Now, I'm thinking to myself, well, if the mummy actually is in a position of recline, what would happen is what would happen happened at Smithfield in London. We have these great Hawksmoor churches, which were built in the 16 and 1700s. And below them at the crypts, they had all these entombed people in lead coffins. A lot of them had died from smallpox. Now, I was actually the last person in Europe to receive the smallpox jab, simply because I had to descend into one of these crypts about 20 years ago to investigate some of these lead coffins, because when we opened them, there was a fear that smallpox spores would actually erupt from inside. What we saw instead was a scene of Gothic horror, because you had these kind of, well, I mean, extraordinary bodies, and they had virtually turned to liquid. Okay, some of them were still mummified, but the brains, and this is really interesting. If you got a tablespoon from your kitchen and you emptied out the skull, the brain had turned into 1 tablespoon full of liquid over a period of 200 or 300 years. Okay, so your brain turns to liquor. Okay, and personally, I prefer to drink liquor rather than have it extracted from me. But you know, that now, if you think about that, that liquor resides at the base of the brain, the side of the head here, because you're in a recumbent position. You're not sitting up. So there's no need, therefore, to remove the brain through the nose. Why did they do it? Well, I think the answer is this. Right here on your nose, about 1 inch back, there is a small piece of magnetite in an area called the ethmoid bone. Okay, now birds and humans and all animals have a piece of magnetite that gives them a sense of direction. So in other words, if you don't know where you're going, I'd go to the doctor and get a chunk of magnetite. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that what they were doing was removing that piece of magnetite in the ethmoid bone in order to allow the soul to be released from the body.
From Earth.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, at that point, having broken through to the cranium, you have to then dig out the brain.
Oh, interesting.
So this is something I find really interesting. And if you look at the end of the book, we talk about the old pharaoh's going to go off to the stars. He's been mummified. Thank you very much indeed. And now we've got the new guy, the new child, the divine child, Horus, the son of Osiris, and he's being reborn in the king's chamber. What did the Wayman-Dixon brothers find in the ascending chambers? They found a knife called the Peshen Kef. And if you look at it, it looks just like a mermaid's tail. Yeah, that's it, exactly it. Yep. And it was used by midwives for actually cutting the umbilicus of the newborn child.
The umbilicus, okay.
Yep. Now, I have a feeling that because the word for pyramid in ancient Egyptian is Mer, M-E-R, in other words, the place of Isis. Okay, and the midwives were maids. They were always maidens. So you have mermaids.
Mermaids, huh?
Okay, you've got the knife with the tail and they're mermaids. I'm absolutely convinced that that is the origin of the mermaid.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
you've got it. Yeah. So there we go. There's a fishy tale for you.
In the Queen's chamber, weren't there just a few artifacts in the Queen's chamber? And this knife in copper was one of them.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm just when I get some time, I'm going to finalize my academic paper on this, and we'll see what happens next. Yes, in fact, we'll call it my epidemic paper, because I was called an epidemic once on the radio. Yes, I was called an extinguished epidemic instead of a distinguished academic.
Well, we have lots of comments and questions and discussions going on. I wanted to mention Cheryl Lynn Moreau, who's been on the program and a good friend of Tony's and friend of ours as well. Astrophysicist, is doing research on the acoustical properties of Chaco Canyon. She's found a space that she's doing further research on.
NGB
NGB, of course. I know, I understand. I wanted to mention that as well, because there's this broad scope of discussion that's happening, and today's discussion is even inspiring some others. I see Tony and Chris are discussing the potential. They're talking. Well, Chris is going to come back with some papers later talking about the effects in Akiva, the acoustical properties of Kiva.
Okay, well, this is certainly very, very interesting. I had a fundamental question, though. How do we know the resonant frequency of the Earth? How is it detected? Maybe you explained that in a way I couldn't follow. But what is the metric? And is it always exactly at this frequency, or might it vary depending on the nature of a place, the history of a place, the spirituality of a place, etc.?
It's it was discovered by a whole raft of scientists back in around about the 1920s, 1930s, Schumann being amongst them. And seismologists, of course, deal with this on a daily basis. It does actually vary, but not significantly so, apart from areas where there's going to be obviously shifting tectonic plates and earthquake activity. And what's curious about earthquake activity as well is that here we are trying to determine how to predict earthquakes and volcanism, etc. And all you have to look at actually is the shifting animal life. Birds and animals particularly are so sensitive to earth rhythms that take themselves away en masse because they feel quite unsettled about it. And I've noticed this with tribal shamans in areas where I've met them in Central America and in Australia particularly. If there's any change of rhythm, they feel very unsettled, quite ill sometimes, and physical. They show great physical symptoms on this too. And they know immediately it's to do with the Earth Mother. They state that quite explicitly. And it's fascinating how sensitive we are, but of course in the Western world we've become, as it were, desensitized over the past 150 years or so, because I guess of our technological progress and the fact we get things to do it for us, I guess.
Well, how are these detected? Are they acoustical? Are they ripples in the Earth's surface? What is the?
Yeah, It's ripples, again, picked up by internal acoustics, again by seismologists and various other bits of machinery. There's a huge science behind it, and there's an awful lot, you know, behind the idea of what the Earth's frequency is and how we can utilize it. I talk about it in the book in chapter, actually in the first chapter, believe it or not. Sorry, my old book is, I've taken out the first 4 chapters of my old book and started with what was chapter 5. But yes, it's all there at the very beginning.
Okay.
I have a related question for David.
Yeah.
Hi, Roy. Good to see you.
Hi, good to see you too.
I have a quick question. So we're talking about the Earth frequency. I think you said 32 hertz. Alpha waves are 13, 14 hertz, at least by your calculations. There's some, you know, wiggle room there. But how do we then translate the Earth frequency to match the alpha? Because there, you know, there's a discrepancy in the hertz. So would you explain that a little bit to me, how that works?
Yeah,
Did
I'm
that
just
make
looking.
sense, my question?
No, that's fine. I'm looking it up in the book now, oddly enough, because I'm having to read my own book to
No, it
explain.
happens. And that's always dangerous to look through a book. I know that. It's like,
So Tony, this is for you.
Okay.
It's basically measured via the ionosphere. So in other words, layers of atmosphere above the Earth act as a giant electrodynamic resonator, and it's in this region that basically we get resonances of 8 hertz, etc. And that's okay, again, how the brain connects in to these sets of frequencies. It's interesting because I was walking through a field of barley in my native southern England about 25 years ago. And it was, I think it was about end of May, June time, when barley is actually, it's good and green, and you've got the long whiskers, and it was actually pollinating. And I didn't know this. It was a local scientist, stroke farmer, who told me this, that barley at this time of the year is only fertile twice a day, and that it's fertile at the time the sun goes up or the sun goes down, which it basically means the whiskers are resonating to Earth frequency. And we actually demonstrated this in a couple of experiments, which unfortunately are not in the book, because I'm saving them for another book to come.
If I could mention as an aside, this has now become the century of multi-messenger astronomy, where we are detecting gravitational waves. We have the LIGO observatories in the United States. There are other ones in different parts of the world. And in 2017, a remarkable discovery was made of the merging of 2 neutron stars. And this was seen by gravity waves. So I'm imagining these frequencies are also detectable by ground observatories. And soon we'll have the LISA experiment that will be in space. I'm involved with that, for detecting gravitational waves. So it'll be really interesting to see how all this couples up.
It'll be fascinating, actually, I have to say. I mean, you know, the Earth is actually hit by external cosmic influences, the supernovae, quasars, etc.
We're seeing black holes and neutron stars colliding half the universe away. It's really amazing.
It's absolutely astonishing. And of course, that has a knock-on effect for us, because when these waves gradually reach the solar system and they hit the Earth's response is to resonate like a bell. It has to resonate at a frequency of vibration in order to, as it were, defend itself, if you want to put it that way, against those external influences. So of course, as the Earth resonates, and it resonates particularly in the cavity of the ionosphere, we have to resonate in tune to it. So life itself has evolved as a measure of a response to that external frequency. It actually has evolved in the embrace of Mother Earth at those particular vibrations. So we are intimately tied on a physical level to our home planet.
Do we have any, there's no way that we can directly, as a human being, sense this, at least with 5 senses, or is there?
There is, yes. You are sensitive to it every day. as I said, when you go into and come out of sleep, that's one example. If you get yourself in,
but that is that of the five senses, or is that the additional senses you're talking about?
I guess it's an additional sense in some ways. I mean, if you look at the work of the great artists, poets, musicians, those people who get inspired, it's almost as if they go, well, in fact, we know they go into an altered state.
The zone,
seems
yes.
to match. Yeah, exactly. They zone in, or is it zone out? It's one of the two.
I think zone in. But...
I guess it depends upon where you come from, really.
Yeah.
As for me, I zone in and out. You know, I'm sort of all over the place. But yeah, so I think it kind of approximates brainwave frequency in that sense, and that's when the inspiration hits. I wrote a poem at the beginning of the book, which was inspired by my trip to Wales. And the only thing I can say about the experience of writing the poem, as well as writing the book and other things that I've written as well, is that I genuinely feel that sometimes it's not me who's written it, it's merely come to me. And I'd really like to be able to admit that in the acknowledgements, but because of modern ways of thinking, you're disbarred from doing it, because otherwise they'll just think you're a crank.
I can say exactly the same thing about scientific discovery. I think everyone I've had, it's come to me. It's not that I've sat and made 10,000 experiments. It has come to me, and then I go do the experiments and prove it.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I really do. And I'm writing a comedy at the moment. I've been working on for quite some time. And I'm going to admit in that book that this came to me, because then at least if people think I'm crazy, they're going to see the whole damn book's crazy, you know. Whereas in this serious book, as it were, I can't. It's so frustrating not being able to say, look, this came through me, it came via me. It's not really mine. It just seems so immodest to put my name on the cover, you know, and take the credit for this, when really the credit's not really due to me. I merely organized it.
Well, all the sages admit they are tapping into some other higher source. And I think energy medicine healers, they say we're the hollow bone. We only can do this work because we're imbibing the life force and then directing it out to the patient.
Yeah, this is so correct, but I totally understand what David said. If I started up a scientific paper saying I had a dream last night, I would probably not have much credibility. But I've had a novelist spend a week in my house, and he tells me the same thing. You know, it's amazing.
I have the last line in this comedy I'm writing, called The Life of Riley, is basically God and Riley, they part and walk off into the sunset. Okay, and God says to Riley, remember, my son, it is better to have loved and lost than never to have lost at all.
Okay.
And I get the sense that actually, you know, it's what you've lost that is so important. Now, that sounds contrary and counter to all processes of logic. But when you've lost something, you get to appreciate it more. And the yearning for it is what drives your quest to understand and appreciate. And nothing speaks more than this than when you come out of a music concert or an experience, and you've kind of exited it, and you've suddenly lost it. You're no longer in that state. You are no longer in the Garden of Eden. It is gone. It is lost, and that is it. And that's what's so interesting about the use of the word we have for a threshold. When you go from the outside of a house to the inside, what do we call that threshold?
The entrance.
Yeah, it's entrance.
Entrance.
Okay. So again, it speaks about you're recovering your loss by going into that state, you know? So it's a tragedy in humanity that we have to lose so much in order to understand.
We want to build a shrine in our backyard, and so now we're thinking about using the local limestone, but adding some granite, maybe finding some radium. No, it's all good, and putting a maze in it. But yes, it's fun.
You're definitely going to need some granite, definitely,
Yes.
and you need to sandwich the two. Right?
Exactly.
Read what I've written about Newgrange in the book, and you'll see it's a recipe for making your own your own site. And best of luck with it. I think it's a great thing to do.
We really want to do that. Yes.
When I get over to the States, I'll come over with my drum and we'll do some omming.
You are welcome. We would love to have you. In fact, Roy and I are thinking about how we can get to the UK and ask you to be our tour guide and show us all the great places.
I'd love to do that, definitely.
We'd love that, wouldn't we?
Yes,
Yeah.
we would.
Absolutely. Remember, we have the om, but we also have the omelette.
Yeah.
Good.
Oh, nice.
That's where you get to crack the cosmic egg and fry it.
Christine and Roy, thank you. And Tony, you're done. Yeah, thank you for your questions.
Thanks, Tony. Great
Yeah.
question.
Good to see you, Tony.
Yeah.
Good to see you all.
I also want to say that it's exciting to me that this whole urge to connect to the heavens, to connect to Mother Earth, to be that liaison between the two as the heroes of old. And you point out, and I like the chapter where you recount all the heroes of the old myths in the various locales and their hallmarks and their purpose to connect. I know that Joseph Campbell and his hero's journey has been one big piece of it, but it's not the only piece. And that if we were all to understand the mythologies, but that the hero's journey or the heroine's journey was to connect the voice of humanity's connection to the stars. Our work is about each of us is that. Our work is that in our trances that we see over and over again two themes that show up again and again. And I mention this because, David, your talk today, your book is helping me understand the importance of this, that it's not an isolated incident, but that I can really keep tracing the threads of the mythologies and see the remnants of spirit journeys in this as well. But over and over again, and I've listed the themes, talked about the themes. We get to talk on the themes. We're writing about these themes that they show up again and again. One is we are the liaison. Our job is to be the liaison, to take Mother Earth's messages and go to the stars, to take the stars' energy and messages and come back home for that. I'm sure Mother Earth can talk to the stars. She is part of a celestial body in herself. She can dialogue with the heavens all she wants, but it's our job to inform ourselves and humanity, to put that message into our mix of what we're doing on Earth. That is an assignment that we get over and over. The other message that keeps showing up again and again and again in myriad forms, life, death, rebirth, that there's this promise of rebirth. We see it in the small cycles, we see it in the large cycles. We see it in our lifetime, we see it in the celestial lifetimes. Life, death, rebirth, again and again. And so for you to say that this is what is at the basis of so much of the ancient myths is, for me, now another remnant of spirit journeys, that I can see spirit journeys, however you get there, we're there, over and over and over again in the world's mythologies. Grounded. You've helped me see that. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is basically what we're here for. I mean, I guess we're all looking for a purpose of life. I mean, I can't get my head around the atheistic argument that this is all there is and that when you die, kaput, that's it.
But this was an ancient wisdom.
It's a curious thing.
Through that transcendence that we are reborn. Maybe it's just through this pathway that we go from non-ordinary, ordinary reality to non-ordinary, that we are reborn. Maybe that's the message, that this is, you want to be reborn, then take that journey into the ultimate.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the whole near-death thing was extraordinary because I was supposed to be dead. I was dead for a long time by medical standards, and yet I was remembering the journey. When I came back, I remembered seeing the doctors from above, looking at them and listening to their conversations, which also reminds me of the Egyptian mortuary cult, where we talk about the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The real translation of the Book of the Dead is not Book of the Dead at all. It's actually the Book of Coming Forth by Light. The Egyptians were an amazingly joyful people who enjoyed life, but seemed to be very savvy about the idea of what death really was. Because their culture was informed by these rituals where they approached it, they saw it, they were prepared for it. Seems to me to make a lot more sense than today, where we're kind of like seeking the elixir of immortality, you know?
Be reborn in the cosmic way. So to help explain the technology, to help give credit to our early ancestors as the scientists they were, if they were really using sacred sites and earth herself and resonance frequency and all of the means to accentuate that, to open these doorways between the realms, then this was a technology. But also they say the temple is within. And so just as you found with your near-death experience with walking into a chapel, this is the technology that is to be activated. And that's our message too. This is the technology, we can activate it, we can open those doorways, and we can do as the sages of the ages have done, the mystics of the ages, we can all be that mystic. We can all imbibe this. And it's our duty as human beings. It makes us more human. It makes us more present. It makes us
you know, there's another thing here as well, believe it or not, the cathedrals and also the Temple of Karnak, the most famous of the Egyptian temples, were built as plans of the human body. They are actually the human body writ large on the landscape. So you're absolutely right to say that, because one reflects the other.
Thank you. This was fun today too.
Thank you, David. And
And thank you guys, and thank you everybody for listening in. I'm thrilled that you were all there, and it's really nice to see you all. And keep safe, everyone. Keep very, very safe.